Welcome back to Gena's book, Nook. We are trying to finish up the story of Edgar Sawtelle by David Wroblewski, and it's just getting to a very serious part. I'm going to be downloading the videos of this pretty quickly so that we can get this book finished by the end of the year. All right, let's jump right in. This chapter is called Wind. All it had taken was one paralyzing look out the rear window of Henry's sedan to realize their sojourn had ended. As soon as the train passed and the state patrol cruiser diverted onto a side street, Edgar jumped into the back seat, and for the rest of the drive he held Tinder and Babu in downstays, ducking and hoping the essay up front with Henry would look unremarkable. He should never have agreed to a joyride in broad daylight. If the state patrol officer had looked at them a little longer, been a little less distracted, well, maybe he would have been reminded that morning of the curious bulletin outstanding for a runaway with 3 dogs. Then the flashers atop his cruiser would have started to spin, and that would have been the end of the day. By the time they pulled onto the driveway, Edgar had resolved to leave at once. Henry stalled him and dug out a map and calculated the distance from Loot to Thunder Bay. It turned out to be over 200 miles. Henry pointed out the impossibility of Tinder walking that far with a half-healed foot. And that's if you go straight through Superior. How did you plan to do that if you're so worried about being spotted? I don't know, Edgar wrote. We'll figure something out. Look, Henry said, if you're dead set on this, let me drive you as far as the border. I know the back roads around here. We can stay off the main highways. I can even get us around Superior. Then it's a straight shot up the North Shore Highway. Let me see that map, Edgar signed. He traced out the route for himself, but there was no real choice. Henry could jump them ahead by weeks in a single day. Once near the border, they could choose a likely spot and continue on foot. After that, they both guessed 5 more days walking to Thunder Bay, 10 if he babied Tinder. In truth, accepting Henry's offer looked like the only way Starchild was reachable. Okay, Edgar signed, but we leave tomorrow. He waited until Henry was asleep that night and walked to the shed and opened the doors. He squeezed his way along the fender of the Skyliner and hiked himself over the door and sat in the driver's seat and rested his palms on the fluted ring of the steering wheel. In the dark, he could barely see his hands. Are you there? He signed. He waited. A long silence followed, and after a time he decided it was no use, and he started to go back to the house, and then he told himself it wouldn't hurt to try anyway, and he lifted his hands in the dark. Did you see that thing in me? He signed. That rare thing. In the morning, Edgar calmed the dogs by running exercises in the yard, fetches, come-fors, heels. They had stayed so long with Henry, the dogs were lax about sticking near him, and now that they were heading out again, they would need those skills. Henry called in sick to work, coughing weakly into the telephone receiver and grinning at Edgar. They left just after 10 o'clock, and when Henry guessed traffic would be lightest. Tinder sat up front, but Edgar stayed in back with the essay and Babu and a set of blankets, trying to shake off his jitters. He downed the dogs and drew the blankets over them whenever a car came into view. Henry was quiet. He lay his arm across the front seat and rested a hand on Tinder's shoulder, and after an hour they were west of Brulé. Henry cut across Highway 2. He had a spot in mind, he said, where they could stop, give the dogs a break, a little cove he and Belva had discovered while exploring the coastline. Keep going, Edgar signed. They don't need it. Are you kidding? Henry said. These dogs are pee machines. I don't want to find out what it's like to wipe that out of the nooks and crannies on my fine vinyl seats. Essay seemed to sense an opportunity, and she peered into Edgar's face and breathed anxiously. Stop it, he signed. You're going to get us in trouble. When they'd left Henry's little valley, the sun was shining between sparse white clouds, but as they approached Lake Superior, the clouds merged into the solid blue mass of the storm front. By the time Henry arrived at the turnout and killed the engine, the sun had been eclipsed by the advancing storm. Henry climbed out of the car, and Edgar sat in the back seat, looking up and down the road for traffic. Relax, Henry said, knocking on the side window. Don't you want to see the lake? Look around. No one's here. Henry was right, but the thought of standing in the open with all three dogs made him edgy. He had spent whatever luck he'd had. On the other hand, the weather was turning ugly, so there was a little chance they'd linger, and it would be harder to let the dogs out in the rain. "See," Henry said, "nobody for miles. You'll like this. Follow me." He led them through stands of scrub pines and maple on a faint trail. The trees were slick with green moss and the ground slippery and made all the more treacherous by the storm gusts that had begun lashing the underbrush. The air was filled with the scent of the lake, and even before Edgar glimpsed water, he heard the smashing of waves against the shore. They emerged near a secluded cove, not much bigger than Henry's yard. At the back stood a sheer rock wall 20 or 30 feet high, forming an irregular curve covered with gray ledges and pocked with erosion holes, some so big they looked like caves. A colony of water birds squawked and flapped near the top, where a shag of turf and tree roots overhung the rock. Edgar saw at once why Henry liked the spot. On a sunny day, it would have felt cozy and secluded, a place where Edgar could have relaxed and watched the flat, watery horizon without fear of being spotted. Up and down the coastline, all he could see were trees on rocky cliffs, no houses, no roads, not even boats on the water. As Edgar and Henry picked their way down the last few feet of trail, the dogs bounded onto the driftwood-strewn beach. Out on the lake, the water beneath the storm had turned black and choppy. A thread of lightning flickered between the sky and the water. When Tinder paused to lift his leg against one of the larger chunks of driftwood, Henry gave Edgar one of his significant looks. The dog was only scent marking, but Henry took it as vindication that the dogs indeed needed a break. "I told you, don't feel bad. You just have to know how to read them," he said modestly. "If you were staying around longer, I could teach you how I know these things. People think it takes some special talent, but I tell them." Then his mouth dropped open and he lifted his hand to point. Something was happening out on the lake. In the time it had taken them to walk onto the beach, the storm front had lowered, blackened, begun to roll over itself. What looked like a puff of steam jumped off the water, disappeared, then formed again. "Tornado," Henry whispered. "Water spout, oh my gosh, look at that." Edgar turned and was instantly riveted at the sight. As the funnel drew water up from the lake, it resolved, bottom to top, translucent at first, then white, then gray. Two more funnels appeared behind the first, woolly tubes dropping from the clouds. A chest-rattling thrum reached them, and the dogs looked up, hackles raised. "This is not good," Henry said. "I don't like this." Somehow, the three funnels gave the impression of standing still and hurtling forward at the same time. Edgar felt no impulse to run or hide or do anything but watch. The most distant of the three was nothing more than a sinuous thread coiling over the water. The one nearest shore, maybe a mile away, had thickened into a sturdy vortex that narrowed to a point at the water's surface. All three were heading east across the lake. If they kept going, they would pass in front of the cove, though not by much. He stood wondering if the storm that had corkscrewed the boards of their barn roof had birthed funnels like these. Henry shared no part of Edgar's fascination. He turned to the steep trail leading into the woods, trotted a few feet, slipped, stood, and turned around. No, we ought to find cover. We don't want to be in a car if they come this way," he said. They say to find a culvert if you can." He surveyed their surroundings and the rock wall curving behind them. "Let's get into one of those caves," he said. "There's no time for anything else." The center funnel lifted off the lake. It was close enough that it seemed to slam against the water when it came down again. Just moments earlier it had looked broad and sluggish. Now it was more compact, as though drawing itself inward, spinning faster, and the noise of it was suddenly very loud. "Matt!" Henry said. "Matt, are you paying attention? We need to get not in the open now." Reluctantly, Edgar tore his gaze away from the water, and he clapped and recalled the dogs at the first real blast of wind, caught him flat against his back. He stumbled and almost pitched forward. By the time he'd gotten the dogs together, Henry stood waiting at the rock wall. "Here and here," Henry said, pointing and shouting above the roar. "We have to split up. Nothing's big enough for all of us." Henry had located two recesses, each a few feet off the ground, alcoves scooped from the rock by thousands of years of waves. Neither was very deep, 4 or 5 feet at the most. There were other deeper nooks in the wall, but they were either too small or too high to reach without an arduous climb. Edgar nodded at Henry and trotted forward. Babu followed at his heels, Essay and Tinder hanging back. The alcoves were separated by 40 feet or more. The leftmost was larger, but also higher and more difficult to reach. Edgar chose that one for himself and 2 of the dogs. He signed Tinder over toward Henry, then turned to Babu. Up. The dog looked at him, trying to make certain what Edgar wanted. Yes, he signed. Up. Then Babu crouched and sprang to the ledge. As soon as the dog landed, Edgar turned to Essay, who was backpedaling toward the water. Come, he signed to her. Up. Essay shook off and retreated again, and Edgar ran to her. No games now, he signed. Come on. He put his hands under her belly and wheelbarrowed her forward. She twisted and mouthed his arm, then broke free and leapt to the ledge beside Babu, and the 2 dogs stood side by side looking at him. Behind them, the roof of the alcove was soot-blackened. Someone had once built a fire inside. The floor, eye level for Edgar, had been swept clean by wind and water. He backed away, holding the dog's gaze, then looked over at Henry and Tinder, who were standing together in the sand. He won't let me lift him, Henry said. He won't jump, and there's no other way. Edgar looked at the vacant hole in the rock. It was just big enough to fit a man and a dog. And Henry was right. Beneath the opening was a ledgeless rock face. There was no way Tinder could climb it. Edgar walked to Tinder and took the dog's head in his hand. You're going to have to try. Henry scrambled onto the ledge while Edgar led Tinder back a few paces. Then Edgar ran forward and slapped his hand against the rock. Come on, Tinder, Henry cried. Try not to get us killed. At first, Tinder just stood there, panting and looking over his shoulder at the funnels roaring on the lake. The sound came from every direction now as the rock wall gathered. It echoed it echoed it back over the water. Twice, urged by Edgar, Henry and the barks of the other dogs, Tinder hobbled forward, but each time he drew up short and lowered his ears and looked at Edgar. Then Essay and Babu leapt down from their ledge and came running across the sand. Edgar caught Essay two-handed as she passed by, but Babu kept running. When he reached Tinder, they touched noses, and then without delay, Babu wheeled and ran to the rock wall. Tinder didn't move. Babu backtracked, barked, and nosed him, and this time they ran forward together, Tinder limping badly. When they reached the rock wall, Tinder launched himself awkwardly into the air, yelping as he left the ground, his feet pedaling. He landed hard, back leg nearly off the ledge and kicking loose sand into the air, but Henry had him by his front legs, pulling him forward. Babu had sailed through the air beside him, but there was barely room for the 3 of them on the tiny ledge, and he jumped down at once. The roar from the lake penetrated every part of Edgar's body. He prodded Essay and Babu toward the other alcove, and they sprang up without hesitation. Edgar scrambled after them. Nat! Came Henry's shout. Edgar looked across the rock wall. Henry knelt on the other ledge, hands cupped around his mouth. There's going to be a lake swell. Stay in the cave. Then there was nothing more to say, and nothing Edgar could have heard over the wind. He turned back to the dogs. They were in a low, shallow scoop that narrowed rapidly into an egg-shaped cavity. Edgar had hoped to block the entrance with his body, but he saw at once that that was impossible at best. He might shield half the opening. He scuttled back, scraping his head on the sooty ceiling, and turned to face the lake. He signed Babu down across one leg and scissored him with the other. Then he downed Essay, who to his amazement complied, and he wrapped both arms around her. This was the best he could do. If they panicked, he could keep them in place for a while at least, maybe long enough to calm them down. And then, backed into that cramped hole, they waited and looked out over the lake. 2 of the waterspouts were close now, their sound a blast of every octave and pitch as they ground their way through the atmosphere. The closest stood a quarter of a mile out, like a cable dropped from a cloud into a ball of water vapor at the lake's surface. A fragment of cloud revolved along its shaft and vanished. Gobs of water splattered against the rocks, gulped out of Lake Superior and thrown landward. It made Edgar think of how his father stood in the doorway of the barn during thunderstorms looking up at the sky. Even as he tried to pull the dogs farther back into the cave, Edgar wondered if his father would be doing the same thing now. As Henry predicted, the water began to rise. The spot where they first sighted the funnels was already submerged by the waves crashing ashore. The wind entered Edgar's nostrils and mouth, puffed out his cheeks, tried to lift the lids of his eyes. Sand and pebbles pelted them. He thought the sound and the wind might cow the dogs, but it didn't. The dogs permitted his hold on them, but never rode back against him for reassurance. A gray chunk of driftwood began to roll end over end along the beach. Come alive now and fleeing for its life, the dogs turned their muzzles to track it. Then the smallest of the funnels slid by, its bloom of water skimming the lake's surface like an upended rose. A jagged thread of light snaked down, drawn to the tree near the shoreline. The sound that followed was more like an explosion than thunder, but it was instantly swept away by the howling wind. When Edgar looked back at the lake, only the larger funnel remained, so squat and black it looked as if the thing were drawing earth and sky together. What happened next took maybe 10 seconds. The ropey funnel that had just passed out of view reappeared, skipping and twisting across the water like a tentacle, moving back along its line of travel. Then the sinuous gray thread of its body was pulled toward the large funnel. They separated for a moment, then twined, the smaller of the two spirals around the larger one, before it was consumed, or nearly so. A whirling streamer peeled away and flailed over the lake, dipping halfway to the water before evaporating. At the same time, the larger funnel changed from ashen to ghostly white, towering palely over the cove, lunging and retreating. Unbelievable, Edgar thought, as the wind buffeted them. What he was seeing was unbelievable. Yet he had seen unbelievable things before came the answer, and he had run from them. That was the moment Essie decided to bolt. One instant, Edgar's arms were wrapped tightly around her chest. The next, she'd slipped as effortlessly as if greased. She dashed across the cove, her bounds foreshortened by the wind. Babu barked and scrabbled his hind feet against the bare rock, but Edgar doubled over and threw his arms around the dog, clamping one hand over his muzzle to stop his thrashing. Almost at once, he understood that Babu didn't intend to follow Essie. He wasn't drawn by her vision, her compulsion. Whatever had made her race to meet the pillar that roared out at them from out on the water, he was only trying to call Essie back. The white funnel lurched toward the shore, 200 yards away now, maybe less. The distance from the Sawtelle's house to the middle of the lower field, and there it came to a standstill, swaying over the lake. Essie faced it, barking and snarling, tail dropped like a scimitar. When she turned sideways, the force of the wind blew her hind feet out from under her, and she rolled, twice, barrel-wise, before scrambling up and facing the wind squarely again, this time carefully holding her ground. Something crashed to the beach in front of the rocks, and a spray of blood pinked the air, and an enormous fish of some kind, guts burst and streaming across the pebbled cove. Now Essie tried to advance. Each time she lifted a foot from the sand, her body wobbled precariously in the gale. Finally, it drove her to the ground. She lay there, ears flattened against her skull, muzzle wrinkled, legs extended like a hieroglyph of a dog. Stripped by the roar of the wind, it seemed to Edgar, to her essence, insane and true, all at the same time. When the wind abated for an instant, her hackles stood. Then it hit again, harder than ever. The trees along the shore whirled and bent and tightened themselves, the breaking of their limits like rifle cracks. I should go out there, Edgar thought. She's going to be killed. But then Babu will bolt. He had time to debate it in his mind, to weigh the loss of one against the other, and he saw there was no way to decide. She had to make this choice. He thought, what his grandfather had always wanted, what he had wished for time and again in his letters. So in the end, Edgar lay on the floor of the cave. Oh, goodness. As the wind fired stones at them like bullets. He redoubled his grip on Babu and watched between his fingers as Essie was driven back to the tree line, crouching and retreating, her muzzle moving but no sound reaching them. And in that moment, he thought, it isn't going to work. I'll never get far enough away. I may as well never have left. How
out on the lake, something changed. I'm so sorry, but I've got to be able to see. Something changed. The funnel stalled, narrowed, whitened still more, then lifted off the water. The steam at its base dropped into the lake as if a spell had been broken. The stem of it writhed in the air above them like a snake suspended from the clouds. The wind lessened and the blast of sound abated. Essie's bark came thinly to them, and Babu began to bark in response. From across the cove, Edgar heard Tinder doing the same. Overhead, the tube of wind slid sickeningly through the air, preparing to crash down again, and this time directly on shore, but without pause. It revolved up into the clouds and disappeared, as if pursuing some tormentor there. A wash of foamy black water swept up from the lake, almost to the rock wall, then carried back with it half the water flooding the little cove. The freight train sound vanished. The wind gusted and was still there with the hiss and boom of waves breaking up and down along the shore. The moment Edgar loosened his grip, Babu sprang from the ledge and ran to Essie, who was already trotting triumphantly before the retreating waves. Babu accompanied her for a few yards, then turned and bounded toward the rocks where Tinder and Henry huddled, and he paced there, waiting. Getting Tinder down was not easy. The rock was wet and slick, and Tinder resisted being carried. Henry took him in his arms and slid down, managing just enough grace to maintain his hold and scraping his back across the rocks in the process. When Henry set Tinder down on the wet sand, the dog limped to the wind-thrown fish and sniffed it. Drops of rain, real rain, not flung like water, began to fall. Out on the lake, a huge mass of driftwood floated in the water like the tangled bones of a sailing ship dredged from the bottom. They found Henry's car plastered with green leaves, the passenger side window spotted a long white crack. They hustled the dogs inside and sat for a long time breathing and listening to the patternless drum of rain on the roof. "There's nothing wrong with that dog," Henry said. "That was hardly a sensible thing to do." Edgar nodded, but he thought, "How can we know?" He closed his eyes, and the image of Ida Payne, bending toward him across her counter, filled his mind. "If you go," she whispered, "don't you come back. Not for nothing. It's just wind, that's all. Just wind. It don't mean nothing. It don't mean nothing." He tried saying that to himself. Oh, goodness. It's kind of all coming together, isn't it? Okay. "Let's turn around," he wrote. "Now that's more like it," Henry said, and he keyed the ignition and wheeled the car around to the road facing the direction they had come, "and at least one of you is thinking straight." Edgar smiled grimly, his face turned to watch the rain and the passing trees. If Henry knew the alternative, he thought he'd like it even less. On the way back, Henry kept the radio off. He drove without comment, except for once, when, apropos of nothing in the moment, he shook his head and muttered, "Christ all Friday." It was steaming hot the next afternoon as Henry's car rolled along the forest road near Scotia Lake, where Edgar and the dogs had passed the 4th of July in what now seemed to him a time of aimless wandering. The water was hidden by trees and foliage. From the inside of the car it all looked unfamiliar. They overshot the driveway before Edgar caught sight of the little red cottage, now boarded up for this season. "Stop," he signed. "That was it." "You sure?" Edgar looked again and nodded. He recognized the white trim in the front door and the window he had crawled through. He remembered, I can barely see this. I'm so sorry. Let me just, I think I got a hair in my eye or something. I don't know. A hair with a tear. Edgar looked again and nodded. He recognized the white trim in the front door and the window he had crawled through. He remembered the taste of the chocolate bar he had stolen there, how it had melted in his back pocket while he fed the dog's butter squeezed through his fingers. Henry nosed his sedan into the weedy drive and killed the engine. I'm going to say this one last time. I can take you all the way to wherever you're going. I don't mind. Thanks, Edgar sighed, but no. He knew Henry wanted him to elaborate, but what he wanted to do there at the lake, whom he hoped to find, what he hoped would result from it, required him to go on foot. He could think of no words to explain his hopes, just as his mother had been unable to find words for the value of their dogs. They got out of the car, and he retrieved the fishing satchel and the zeb coat from the trunk. He hooked the satchel strap over his shoulder. The dogs nosed about until their curiosity was satisfied. Then they trotted back to the car. Tinder first, limping out of the underbrush, followed by Babu and Essie. Edgar knelt in front of Tinder and stroked its muzzle. Guys, I had no idea this chapter was going to be so hard. He lifted for the last time, his injured foot to run his tips over the scarred pad. He watched Tinder for a flinch, but the dog only peered back at him. All of the swelling was gone now, but his second toe still stood out. He set Tinder's foot down. Tinder lifted and presented it again. Stay, he sighed. He did this out of habit. He had immediately wished to take it back, for it wasn't what he meant. He started to get up and then he knelt again. Watch Henry. He doesn't know much yet. Then he stood and held out his hand and Henry shook it. All you ever need to do is come back and ask, Henry said. I'll take good care of him until then. No. He belongs to you. He chose you. And he had. Edgar could see it as Tinder sat bright-eyed and panting and leaning slightly against Henry's leg. He'd seen it in the car, driving back from Lake Superior, and later that night at Henry's house. It seemed to Edgar that Tinder was still making the leap onto the ledge to join Henry, and in one way or another he would be making it every day for the rest of his life. Edgar turned and walked up the cabin driveway, and Babu and Essie beside him. He let himself look back just once. Henry and Tinder stood by the car watching them go, and when they reached the lake, Babu noticed that Tinder wasn't following. He looked at Edgar, then wheeled and trotted back toward the car. Halfway there, he came to a halt. Edgar stopped and turned and slapped his leg, and Babu came toward him a few steps, then looked over his shoulder at Henry and Tinder by the car, and whined unhappily and sat. Edgar stood looking at the dog, and he walked back and down in front of him. You have to be sure, he signed. Babu peered at him, panting. He looked past Edgar's shoulder at Essie. After a long time, Babu stood, and together they trudged to the car. Babu bounded the last 20 feet, jumped into the back seat to join Tinder. It's not about me, is it? Henry said. He can't leave Tinder. No. You think I could do right by both of them? Edgar nodded. It's okay with me. I mean, hell, more than okay. Edgar stood looking at the two dogs for a long time, trying to fix the memory of them in his mind. Then as they trotted up and Babu jumped out to meet her. They circled end to end as if they hadn't seen each other for a long time, and Babu lay his muzzle along her neck. Edgar turned and walked up the drive. He didn't give a recall or any other command. He couldn't bear to turn around. The underbrush whipped his face, but he hardly noticed it over the pounding in his head. He squeezed his eyes down to slits, but the tears leaked out anyway. Eventually, Essay appeared by his side, and then she bolted ahead and vanished into the underbrush. No more commands, he thought. Never again. She knew where they were as well as he, and she could run as she pleased. Behind him, Henry's car groaned to life, and despite himself, Edgar tracked the sound as it rolled along the road until, even standing still, only the forest sounds came to him. Holy cow, friends! Thinking about those dogs having their choice, and I think when we have animals or kids, we control it, and instead of teaching them to choose, and that's really, I think, the essence of what the Sawtelles were doing. Do you think it worked? Let's keep going. This is called Return. They spent that night on the spit of land where they had watched the fireworks consumed by their own reflections, where the howling of the dogs had moved another watcher to announce himself. The next day they walked the perimeter of the lake, shady patches giving onto cattails and vast tracts of water lilies. Leopard frogs bounded into the water wherever they stepped. The fish were plentiful, the campers sparse. Most of the cabins had been shut down for the season, plywood nailed across their windows, and there was no point in forcing his way into them. Henry had supplied him with matches, fish hooks, and a small, narrow, brown-handled pocket knife with ivory inlays. For each of the next 3 nights, they moved their camp a little farther into the low hills of the Scotia Lake. Each adjusted to the solitary life more quickly than Edgar expected. At night, she and Edgar slept spooned together against the chilled air. She understood that they waited for someone or something. At times, she stood and paced, scenting for her 2 missing littermates. The days had grown shorter now. The August dusk began by 7 o'clock, night an hour after that. Late in the evening, on the fourth night, when their small fire had burned down to embers, a pair of eyes glinted in the underbrush. Not deer or raccoon, whose eyes reflected the orange firelight as green. These eyes mirrored red when the flame was red, yellow when it was yellow, disappearing for an instant and then flickering back. Their possessor had approached from upwind, a habit, Edgar supposed, after all that time in the woods. He lay an arm across Essay's back. He'd saved a bit of fish, and he'd picked it up now and tossed it across the fire. Forte stepped out of the shadows. He padded forward to sniff the offering, and when Essay saw him, her body tensed. But Edgar asked her to stay with the pressure of his hand. It wasn't a command. He felt he hadn't the right anymore. That had long ago fallen from grace, but only recently had he understood it. The stray colors were just as Edgar remembered. Amber and black across his back, his chest broad and blonde. One of his ears hung tattered from some fight long past. Oh, goodness. One more tissue, friends. As they rumbled a warning in her throat, and Forte retreated into the dark. Edgar nursed the fire longly into the night, bent over the coals like a wizened old man, fatigued, though they had hardly done a thing all day in the morning. Essay, too, was gone. She returned at noon, panting and covered with burrs. Edgar had already amassed a great number of fish. He tried the fish on sticks, and they gorged themselves. He fried the fish on sticks, When Essay turned her nose away, he urged her to eat it anyway. It was important she not want it later. He fished some more and cooked the fish, and thought of Henry sitting at the card table behind his house, roasting bratwurst, while he and the dogs looked on from their hiding place by the sunflowers. Blue evening reflected in the water. Star-shot cirrus veils. Forte appeared again late that evening, and this time Essay trotted forward to meet him and scented his flanks while he stood rigidly waiting. Then she posed in return. When Forte left, much later, the pile of fish Edgar had set aside was gone. He began to fish again, and as soon as he woke the next day, he cooked the fish and stacked them up. Catcalls sounded from the woods around them, and when they had eaten their fill, he stuffed the remainder into a satchel and left the Zebco lying on the ground, and they set out. The traveling was easy now. He didn't understand why it would take him so long to cross such a meager distance on the way out. In a single day, they covered a quarter of their return. Occasionally, he dropped a shred of cooked fish onto the ground as a trail. He wondered if he would recognize the route they'd taken all those weeks before. He did. Essie disappeared for an hour or more at times, but always he kept moving. Then there would be a rattle of bracken, and she would burst into a clearing and dash over to him, swiping her tail through the air. They came upon a familiar lake late in the day, and he built a small fire. He sat beside the dying embers as if trading them for dreams. He knew for certain that Forte was following, as he had hoped only on the second night. They'd walked all day picking at the fish, a particle for himself, a particle for Essie, a particle tossed on the ground. Essie rooted for turtle eggs, but that season was past. A few stray blueberries hung on bushes, cooked in their skins. They stopped midday along the lake, and Edgar stripped and walked into the water and stood until his skin cooled and the fresh mosquito bites stopped itching. An egret lifted out of the reeds near the lake's edge, white and archaic. It glided across the water and settled near the shore, a safe distance away, and caught its subjection to the scaring the fish. But the egret was wrong. Edgar ate only the fish that remained in the satchel, reheating them over the fire. He was tired of eating them. He set the remainder of their cache near the edge of the firelight. He suspected it was a bad idea. The satchel was greasy from the fat in the bodies of the fish. Perhaps every bear in the region knew where they were by now. But so would Forte. And he was right about that. When he woke in the morning, the stray raised his muzzle and gazed over him over the glowing char of the fire. He lay still. Essie stood and circled to Forte and nosed him, and both dogs circled back. Forte extended his neck and scented him, legs trembling. He stroked Essie under the chin, then let his hand pass to Forte. When he stood, the dog backpedaled. With his one shredded ear, he looked at once comical and cagey. Edgar turned his back and gathered his things, and when he turned around, Forte was gone, as was Essie. Now Almondine occupied his thoughts. He hadn't seen her for 2 months or more, and suddenly it felt like he'd been severed from some fundament of his being. At the end of the next day, or the day after that, they would be joined again. Perhaps she would have forgotten his crimes, for which he wanted more than anything to atone. Everything that had happened to him since he left made him think of her. Others dreamed of finding a person in the world whose soul was made in the mirror image, but she and Edgar had been conceived nearly together, grown up together, and however strange it might be, she was his other. Much could be endured for that. He also knew that she was old, and he had squandered. I really have to get another tissue. Look, if you're not a dog lover by now, I think you probably should not listen to the rest of the book, because there will be more tissues. All right. Everything that had happened to him since he left made him think of her. Others dreamed of finding a person in the world whose soul was made in their mirror image, but she and Edgar had been conceived nearly together, grown up together, and however strange it might be, she was his other. Much could be endured for that. He also knew that she was old, and he had squandered some portion of their time circling in the woods, blind, confused, stopping and starting with only vague notions of what to do. Without the strangest kind of intercession, he might never have seen her again. Perhaps only when he had become an old man would he realize how reduced he'd been by that decision, how withered he'd become away from her. He'd left in confusion, but his return was clarifying. So much of what had been obscure while he faced away was now evident. No sooner had he walked away from that cove by the lake than the need to go home possessed him. He understood the rightness of Tinder's decision and Bamboo's. Henry was a fretful person, filled with doubts and worries, but he was faithful as well. Edgar wondered what would have happened to them if Tinder had injured his foot a mile farther along. So much of the world was governed by chance. If they had left Henry's house one day earlier, they might have been in Canada that very moment. Maybe even at Sawtelle Colony, life was a swarm of accidents waiting in the treetops, depending upon any living thing that passed, ready to eat them alive. You swim in a river of chance and coincidence. You clung to the happiest accidents, the rest you let float by. You meet a good man in whose care a dog would be safe. You look around and discover the most unusual thing in the world sitting there looking at you. Some things were certain. They had already happened, but the future could not be divined. Perhaps by Ida Payne. For everyone else, the future was no ally. A person had only life to barter with. He felt that way. He could lose himself to Sawtelle Colony or trade what he held for something he cared about. That rare thing. Either way, his life would be spent. These were his thoughts as he walked the edge of the marshy clearing. Across the way, Essie bounded and turned and nipped at Forte, who followed her, suddenly awkward and puppy-like. At length, from Forte's ineptitude and lurching clumsily, a fight broke out between them, but it was a mock battle. And soon Essie gallivanted over to Edgar, ignoring the lout. They slept far from water or any landmark familiar to him. He made a fire for warmth and let it bake. Forte lay watching, curled beneath a chestnut sapling. That night, Edgar crossed the lighted circle to sit near the stray and work the burrs out of his coat. When he finished, he stroked the animal along his withers. Forte scented his wrist. He remembered those nights in the garden. Forte silvered in the moonlight, quivering beneath his hands. Then Edgar returned to his side of the fire. His last thought before he slept was that he was glad not to be eating fish, even if it meant going hungry. Sorry, friends. You want me to be able to see, right? The next morning they set off eastward, tracing shadows back to their source again and again. Essie and Forte disappeared. When he saw Essie again, her muzzle was stained red with fresh blood. He knelt beside her and ran his fingers along her gumline and ruff and legs, but the blood was not hers, and Forte was nowhere to be seen. They came to the clearing filled with fire-scarred trees where they had stopped the very first night, where the owls had turned to watch them. He began to run. The sumac blazed red where earlier it stood like green parasols. When he looked down, Essie was by his side. The old logging trail appeared. They came to the fence line set in the middle of the creek, and the water was no more than a trickle, and the fence post it uprooted sat cockeyed in the silt and dirt. He stepped into the water and lifted the barbed wire. Essie passed beneath almost without breaking stride. On the far side, she shook herself needlessly and waited. The creek water slipped over the sand and rocks, and he stood waiting for Forte. After a time, he decided the dog would find his own way to cross, if he was going to cross at all. He pushed the fence post over and stepped across the wires, not bothering to restore it as he walked back onto their land. I'm going to stop there because I need to clear my eyes. I'm going to be back with another recording, though. Stay tuned.